The last confirmed signal from Daniel Reeves' truck came at exactly 2:17 a.m., somewhere deep along a forgotten stretch of rural Mississippi highway where GPS signals tend to flicker and die like exhausted fireflies. The dispatcher didn't think much of it at first. Drivers lost signal all the time in that region. But when Daniel missed his scheduled check-in at 3 a.m., something began to feel wrong. Not late, not delayed. Wrong. Daniel wasn't the type to miss anything. For 12 years, he had driven the same long-haul routes across the southern United States, delivering refrigerated goods with machine-like precision. His logs were perfect, his timings predictable, his habits unchanging. He called his wife Leela every night at exactly 9:30 p.m., no matter where he was parked. He double-checked his cargo seals. He avoided shortcuts. And he never, ever stopped in places he didn't trust. Which is why what happened next made no sense. When morning came and Daniel still hadn't responded, the company pinged his truck again. Nothing. By noon, they escalated it. By evening, local authorities were contacted, and by the next day, a search operation quietly began. They found the truck 3 days later. It was parked just off a narrow dirt road that didn't appear on most maps, hidden behind a wall of overgrown trees and tangled brush. At first glance, it looked intact. No signs of a crash, no forced entry, no visible damage. The cargo frozen meat products was still inside, partially thawed but untouched. But the cab door was open, and Daniel Reeves was gone. The interior of the truck told a story that investigators couldn't quite piece together. His phone was on the dashboard, screen cracked but still functional. His wallet lay on the passenger seat. The keys were still in the ignition. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass, no overturned objects, just one detail that didn't belong. The driver's side floor mat was soaked in mud. Not ordinary roadside dirt, but thick, dark, almost clay-like soil wet, as if Daniel had stepped in something deep before climbing back into the cab. But outside the truck, the ground was dry. And then there was the smell. One of the officers later described it as faint but unmistakable. Not rot, not decay, something else, something metallic, mixed with something that shouldn't have been there at all. They followed the dirt road. It stretched for nearly 2 miles, winding deeper into the woods, narrowing as it went until it barely looked passable for a vehicle Daniel's size. Tire tracks confirmed he had driven that way, though no one could explain why. The road eventually opened into a clearing. That's where they found the farm. At least, that's what it appeared to be. A cluster of old buildings sat under the shadow of towering trees, structures that looked abandoned at first glance, but revealed subtle signs of recent activity upon closer inspection. A rusted barn, a sagging farmhouse, several smaller sheds scattered around the perimeter. No vehicles, no people, no animals. Too quiet. The officers approached cautiously. Inside the barn, they found hooks hanging from overhead beams, stained dark from years of use. Large cutting tables lined one side, their surfaces scarred and grooved. Tools were scattered across them, knives, cleavers, saws all cleaned too thoroughly, as if someone had gone out of their way to erase every trace of what they had been used for. But it wasn't the tools that unsettled them. It was the scale. This wasn't a small operation. Whatever had been happening here had been happening for a long time. In the farmhouse, things became stranger. The interior was surprisingly clean. Not modern, not maintained in a traditional sense, but orderly, as if someone lived there and cared enough to keep things arranged, but not enough to update anything. Old furniture, faded curtains, dust that had been disturbed recently, and photographs, dozens of them. They covered one entire wall in the living room. Pictures of people, men, women, different ages, different backgrounds, none of them smiling. At first, investigators assumed they were family portraits, but the more they looked, the more unsettling it became. The people didn't resemble each other. The clothing varied wildly in style and era. Some photos looked recent. Others appeared decades old, and none of the faces matched the owner of the property. Because there was no record of an owner, the land had no clear documentation, no registered deed, It existed in a strange legal gray zone, passed between shell entities and dissolved accounts for years. It was as if someone had deliberately erased its history. Then they found the basement. The door was hidden beneath a rug. In the kitchen, an old wooden hatch that blended almost perfectly with the floor. It took 2 officers to pry it open. The smell hit them first, stronger this time, heavier. The kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat and refuses to leave. They descended slowly. The basement was larger than expected, far larger than the house above should have allowed. The space had been expanded, dug out, reinforced with crude wooden supports. Dim light bulbs hung from the ceiling, some flickering, others dead. And then they saw it. Rows of metal cages, some empty, some not. The first body they found wasn't Daniel. It was older, decomposed beyond recognition. But it wasn't buried. It wasn't hidden. It was left in a way that suggested it had been processed. Parts missing, bones exposed in unnatural ways. That's when the investigation changed. This wasn't a missing persons case anymore. It was something else entirely. They called in federal authorities, forensics teams, specialists. The farm was sealed off, and the surrounding area was searched extensively. What they uncovered over the next week would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in the region's history. But the most chilling detail came from a single piece of evidence: a journal. It was found in the farmhouse, tucked inside a drawer beneath a stack of old papers. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed, but the writing inside was clear, careful, deliberate, almost clinical. The entries spanned years. Whoever wrote it had documented everything, not in a frantic or emotional way, but with precision. Observations, measurements, notes on behavior, diet, physical condition. And then there were the lists. Names, dozens of them, each crossed out, except one. At the very bottom of the final page, written more recently than the rest, was a name that made the lead investigator stop cold: Daniel Reeves. But what terrified them wasn't just the name, it was the note written beside it. Still adapting, not ready. And as the team processed the scene, cataloging evidence and trying to make sense of the nightmare they had uncovered, one question began to spread quietly among them. A question no one wanted to say out loud. If Daniel wasn't dead, then where was he? Because there was no sign of him anywhere on the property. No body, no blood, no trace. Just the truck, the mud, the farm, and the growing, suffocating realization that whatever had been happening there might not be over. Part 2. The moment the journal entry was verified, everything shifted. Daniel Reeves was no longer just missing. He was classified as an active subject in an ongoing, unknown operation. The wording in the journal, still adapting, not ready, haunted every investigator on site. It suggested time, process, intention, and worst of all, it suggested Daniel was still alive. The farm was immediately upgraded to a high-priority crime scene. Federal agents expanded the perimeter, drones scanned the surrounding woods, and K-9 units were brought in to track any possible movement. But the deeper they searched, the more unsettling the silence became. No footprints leading away. No tire tracks beyond Daniel's. No signs of recent escape. It was as if the land itself had swallowed him whole. Then, on the 5th day of the search, something changed. One of the K-9 units caught a scent. Not from the farmhouse, not from the barn, but from the far edge of the property beyond the tree line, where the ground dipped into a shallow ravine choked with vines and rotting vegetation. The handler followed carefully, pushing through the dense undergrowth until he reached what looked like a collapsed section of earth. At first glance, it appeared natural, but when they cleared the debris, they found wood beneath the soil. A door. Old, reinforced, hidden deliberately. It took hours to break it open. What they found beneath would explain everything and nothing. The tunnel stretched far deeper than anyone expected. It wasn't just a passage. It was a network. Narrow corridors branched in multiple directions, reinforced with timber and lined with crude wiring that powered dim, flickering lights. The air was damp, heavy, and carried that same metallic scent they had noticed before, but stronger now, suffocating. This wasn't an escape route. This was an extension of the farm, and it was still in use. They moved in teams, slowly, methodically, every step echoing through the confined space as they cleared each corridor. Some tunnels led to dead ends, small rooms filled with tools, storage containers, and disturbing remnants of whatever had taken place here. Others led deeper, far deeper, and then they heard it, a sound, faint, almost indistinguishable from the hum of the underground air. But it was there, a low, irregular noise, breathing. They froze. One of the agents signaled silence, and the team listened carefully. The sound came again, weak, uneven, but undeniably human. They followed it. The tunnel narrowed as they advanced, forcing them to move single file. The walls grew rougher, less structured, as if this section had been dug more recently or more urgently. The breathing grew louder, closer, until they reached a small chamber at the end of the passage, and that's where they found him. Daniel Reeves was alive, barely. He was lying on a thin, stained mattress, his body emaciated, his skin pale and stretched tight over bone. His arms were restrained, not tightly, but enough to limit movement. His eyes were open, unfocused, as if he were conscious but not fully present. But what disturbed them most wasn't his condition. It was the setup. This wasn't a holding cell. It was something else. The walls were lined with notes, more of the same careful handwriting from the journal. Charts, observations, diagrams. Some of them referenced physical changes, others detailed behavioral responses. And then there were the containers, glass jars, dozens of them, each labeled, each filled with substances no one could immediately identify. Daniel wasn't just being held, he was being studied. The team moved quickly, cutting his restraints and calling for medical extraction. But as they lifted him, one of the agents noticed something that made his stomach drop. Daniel's fingernails. They were wrong, thicker, darkened, almost claw-like, and his teeth, they weren't the same. Subtle changes, but enough to be unmistakable. Something had been done to him, something deliberate. As they carried him out, Daniel suddenly reacted. His body tensed, his breathing spiked, and for a brief moment his eyes focused, locking onto one of the agents with an intensity that felt unnatural. Then he spoke. His voice was dry, cracked, barely audible. But the words were clear. "They're not gone." The tunnel fell silent. "What do you mean?" one agent asked, leaning closer. Daniel's lips trembled as he tried to form the words. "They're watching, waiting." Before he could say anything else, his body went limp, unconscious. He was rushed to the surface, airlifted to the nearest medical facility under heavy supervision. The discovery should have been a breakthrough. A survivor, a witness, answers. But instead it raised more questions. Because back at the farm, the investigation took another turn. In the deepest section of the tunnel network beyond where Daniel had been found, agents uncovered something they hadn't expected. Another chamber, larger, reinforced, and empty. Too empty. Unlike the other rooms, this one had no tools, no notes, no equipment. Just a wide, open space with markings on the floor, deep grooves carved into the ground, forming a pattern no one could immediately understand. And on one wall, a single message, written in the same careful handwriting as the journal, but different, less controlled, more urgent. They learned faster than expected. That's when the realization began to spread. This wasn't the work of one person. It never had been. The farm, the tunnels, the journal, it all pointed to a system, a process that had been running for years, possibly decades. And if Daniel had been labeled as not ready, then there had been others, ones who were. The search expanded again, beyond the property, into nearby towns. Missing persons reports were reopened, cross-referenced with the names in the journal. Patterns began to emerge. Truck drivers, hitchhikers, travelers passing through remote routes, people who wouldn't be missed right away, people who could disappear. And as investigators dug deeper, one final piece of evidence surfaced: surveillance footage from a gas station nearly 40 miles away, taken 2 nights before Daniel's truck was found. The footage showed a figure entering the store just before closing, tall, thin, wearing a hood. The clerk later reported nothing unusual, just another late-night customer. But when they reviewed the footage frame by frame, something stood out. The way the figure moved, not quite right, too stiff in some moments, too fluid in others. And when the hood briefly shifted, revealing part of the face, the room went silent. Because the features didn't fully match any single person, it looked dissembled, familiar, but wrong. And then, in the final seconds of the clip, the figure turned toward the camera, smiled, and walked out. By the time authorities reached the location, the trail was already cold. No vehicle, no direction, no trace. Just the lingering possibility that whatever had been created on that farm was no longer contained. And as Daniel Reeves lay in a hospital bed miles away, monitored, stabilized, but still not fully understood, one question remained unanswered. Not what happened to him, but what he might become. Because late that night, as the nurse checked his vitals, she noticed something change. His heart rate spiked suddenly, his eyes opened, and for a split second, he smiled, the same way the figure in the footage had.